Welcome to American Literature. I think this is week 3, and my name is your teacher, Andrew Smith, and we're doing kind of a mixtape talks. We on Friday, and I'll share that information with you via email. We did a talk on America as a mixtape and really looking for America. And I tried to connect in Friday's talk great movies about America with great mixtapes from those films. And I even gave an extra credit assignment that you all could consider doing for this early period in the semester where there are no blogs due. But today is speaking of a dusting of snow, this is a dusting off of a lecture I've been giving in some form or fashion for some time about blues, the blues music and the gospel music and the hip hop and African-American culture. And it just so happens today is February 1st, the first day of Black History Month. So what a better time here in February 2021 to talk about this important issue, especially during this time period when racial justice and injustice has been on everyone's mind, especially since the murder of George Floyd last summer and the greatest and largest civil rights movement in the history of planet Earth, the international global Black Lives Matter movement. So here we are. And I begin with the novelist Toni Morrison. And what we're doing is we're connecting, as you have not tuned into the previous lectures, we're connecting a few genres such as film and music to the traditional genres of literature, poetry, story, and story being nonfiction and fiction stories. So Toni Morrison, great. And this is all today a story that is the foundation of Black American literary studies in the music of gospel, blues, and hip hop, with maybe a nod here to jazz and R&B and funk in there as well, and soul music as well. And there's a playlist that goes with this, which I've shared with you now via email. Normally in the old face-to-face classroom, if we had a good teacher computer and a good sound system, we would rock out the tunes, but because these are being lectures are being digitized and put online and for copyright reasons and for audio file reasons, it's not a good sound quality for me to just sit here and play tunes through my computer to your headphones. By the time it gets to you, it doesn't sound that good. So you're going to have to listen to those songs on your own time. And I'm muting somebody on the call. Just try to stay muted on the call, please. Getting a lot of feedback there. Speaking of audio problems. So, but there's a playlist of about an hour long that with your preferred headphones or earbuds or speakers, you guys can rock out to on your own time. And I strongly encourage you to check out the Blues Gospel Hip Hop Mixtape 2021 by yours truly, Andrew Smith, aka Teacher on the Radio. So briefly, Beloved is a historical fantasy novel that involves escaped slaves that have moved to Ohio, and these slave catchers, these kind of, extrajudicial thugs that would go into the freed territories, sometimes with the consent of the law in the freed territories, but they were kind of hired thugs, mercenaries, bounty hunters from the slave territories, and they would go into freed land and they would capture slaves and take them back to the slave plantation. And so this is a true story that it's a nonfiction reality that is fictionalized in this novel by Toni Morrison, which is a historical fantasy. It's actually a ghost story, goes well with Halloween. And so in the story, the mother is there, and these slave hunters are coming to steal her babies. And in this one particular incident, she gets so afraid of what's going to happen to her baby if it's taken back into slavery. And she, as a survivor of slavery, and she has PTSD, post-traumatic slavery disorder. And so she murders her child rather than allow her child to be sold back into or stolen back into slavery. And then what happens in the story is this woman starts to go crazy and she's haunted by the ghost. And so the ghost of her child, named Beloved, comes and haunts her for the rest of, the story. So it's a very intense story, but there's this beautiful, passionate portion of the tale where there's a lady preacher, a slave preacher, and church, they let the slaves have the Bible, but they wanted, to read, the Apostle Paul about slaves being obedient to your masters. They didn't want to read all the good stuff about Moses, let my people go and leading people to freedom. And Jesus, the great liberator. They didn't want to read stories about Jesus, defying Pilate and Herod, or Moses defying Pharaoh. They only wanted to read the part where Paul says slaves be obedient to the masters. But the slaves would have their own church, and they'd go out in the woods, out in creation, out where God is in the wind and in the trees and in the critters, right? And they would go out and have their country church. And Baby Shugs is the character in the story, and she's out there having country church, and she starts preaching a fire, and she says, "In the beginning was the sound." And of course, that's a riff on John's Gospel or the Book of Genesis. Definitely in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and called it good. Right? The earth is good. God created it, made it good. But in John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Well, in the beginning was the sound, said Toni Morrison. In the beginning was the sound. And in America's mythology, the beginning is the sound of the gospel music and the blues music, which forms all the great popular musics that we know, which is, everything you listen to, hip hop, country, whatever, rock and roll, alternative, whatever is in your, iTunes or whatever they call that now, Apple Music, or in your Spotify playlist of the week. It all comes from this river, from this wellspring, from this great source called gospel and the blues. And it is a black music that was born out of bondage. It is the blues and gospel, the sound of freedom and the sound of rebellion and the sound of suffering and the sound of pain and the sound of poverty. In the beginning was the sound. So we're just going to learn just a little bit about that today. And one of the great things about pairing up the gospel and the blues is, in some people's mind, they're opposites, right? Gospel is God's music. Blues is the devil's music. And this is this particular chasm, this precipice, this distance, right, between Saturday night when the party is going on at the juke joint and Sunday morning when they are getting the Holy Spirit in the Pentecostal way, and they're getting all slaved in the Spirit and falling out and falling down into the Spirit on Sunday morning. The distance between Saturday night and Sunday morning, that vast distance between God's music and the devil's music, it gets a lot closer when you realize that Saturday night doesn't ever really end. The people who are really into their jams and their tunes, they don't want to go to bed, and 1 a.m., 2 a.m., next thing you know, you're still up at 4 a.m. and you're gonna sleep through church. To be honest with you, your Saturday night will see the sunrise on Sunday morning. Then you'll take a little nap before you eat some bagels and biscuits and bacon later. So this tension between the blues and the gospel is so interesting because it can be seen as opposites, or they can be seen as unity in the vernacular tradition of African-American folk traditions that formed all of great American popular culture, particularly rock and roll. Elvis, born in a little cabin in Tupelo, Mississippi. Elvis Presley adopted what he learned from his neighbors who were African American. Even though the South was segregated, children would oftentimes cross over these boundaries of segregation. And one of the things that was happening in that crossover and in that code switching was music. Music was happening, and the music of the church was happening. Now, some of you go to white churches that knew how to throw down. Today, you have a really, really good band, but I come from the Protestant tradition that is known as the frozen chosen. And that's where, white church, you just sit still and you don't really get down. You just kind of sit in your pew. You don't raise your hand. You definitely don't get slayed in the Spirit. There's no charismatic gifts going on, but you might even be so bored, there you might be scribbling on the bulletin, and the hymnody is very kind of stilted. It's a stuck hymnody. And then coming out of the black church tradition, especially here in the South, is this fire and this power and this passion that is really the passion of freedom. And that's really what this lecture is about, among other things, is a story of freedom. So we are learning today about the gospel shout and its relationship to the blues moan, blues, gospel, hip hop, and the African American literary experience for today, the first day of Black History Month, 2021. I'm going to lean on several other thinkers and talkers to walk you through this whirlwind tour through this backbone basis of everything that is beautiful about this discipline of American studies, which is really what we're doing this semester, because we're not reading a book story just strictly in a very stilted way, because the poetics of the blues is so boundaryless, and which has become the poetics of rock and roll and the poetics of folk and hip hop and indie and everything that we love, that makes us want to get up and dance. And especially during this pandemic, don't forget to dance. You can't go to a concert or a Bonnaroo, but you can, put on your headset and feel the spirit that way. But I've got several fellow travelers, some that I've met, some that I've not met, some that I've just read in books. But this one is somebody that I've met and I've worked with. OM3, the Reverend Otis Moss III, comes out of Trinity United Church of Christ up there in Chicago, Illinois. And he says, they could not distinguish between the gospel shout and the blues moan. Joy is always married to sorrow. Tragedy is forever engaged to triumph. Praise and pain are first cousins. Worship and weeping are constantly flirting with each other. So rather than the opposites, the devil versus God paradigm of gospel and blues, Pastor Moss sees these two as siblings in the struggle for Black freedom. Something to keep in mind, because we are going to see that tension is active even now. It's not completely resolved in the tradition. So I'm a budding blues scholar. I'm wearing my hat from the Cathead Blues Store in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I just came on a record buying and blues vibing tour of Mississippi over my winter break. Socially distanced, wearing my mask, of course. I started down on the coast in Biloxi and made my way up to Hattiesburg, and then to Roland, and then to Cleveland and Clarksdale and Tupelo and Oxford, Mississippi, and all the other Mississippis in between. And I imbibed these blues vibes as I was also buying books and music and souvenirs along the way, listening to my playlists, of course, in the car as we were driving around. But a guy who cut his blues teeth in the Motor City of Detroit, and also down in the bayou of New Orleans. And then he went to Europe for a long time because he likes to smoke the weed, and the weed was legal over there. And then he came back to Detroit finally, and they've been celebrating him for a couple of years in Detroit now, since they finally legalized the ganja up there in Detroit, because he went to jail when he was a young man for smoking the stuff. And even John Lennon of the Beatles, you might have heard of the Beatles. John Lennon of the Beatles wrote a song about Brother John when he was up in the joint, for having a joint. And of course, I'm not condoning any of this. Don't anybody get off the call, go home to mama. The English professor was talking about smoking the green buds, because I don't do that. I don't condone that. Don't misunderstand my history story as a lecture about that. But do understand that in the blues tradition, there was alcohol, there was cocaine, definitely marijuana, there was heroin. I mean, there was a lot of bad stuff in there. And as I gave a trigger warning last week in my lecture, then it will span the truth of this whole semester. When we study the literary culture, these were people who lived on the wild side of life, and to study it honestly and with any integrity whatsoever, we want to see that it was, the not the Trinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit of the gospel tradition, but the secular Trinity of sex, drugs, and rock and roll is all shot through the American cultural milieu that we'll be studying this semester. And we wrestle with it, and we'll see people, trying to get clean and sober, and we'll see people dying. We'll be looking at Jack Kerouac next week. Jack Kerouac dies of his addictions. But anyway, John Sinclair, that was a long introduction to a blues scholar, because he's one of my teachers, and he wrote a lot of poetry about the Delta. And this is his book, about 20-year-old book, or maybe 25-year-old book. Let's see. This book came out in 2002, so it's 19 years old. It's called Fattening Frogs for Snakes, the Delta Sound Suite, from the Regional Press of New Orleans. It is got an introduction by Amiri Baraka, a Beat Generation poet we'll be looking at later. And I read you a poem of this, I believe last week, or the first day of class, actually. So I'm going to get back into this. Is this week 3 already? It's just going by. I think it is week 3. It's going by too fast. So so here we go. So Fattening Frogs for Snakes by John Sinclair, another poem of his. I think I read the Delta Sound on the first of class. There's a recording of him saying that with a band on the playlist, which I've sent to you. He says, coming out of Mississippi, out of the mouths of children and the grandchildren of slavery, right around the turn of the 20th century, callous fingertips pressed down on the strings of beat-up guitars, or small-town street corners, broken down backwoods joints in the darkness of Saturday night, or a bright Sunday morning in a ramshackle clapboard church, making music to praise the Lord and give thanks for another backbreaking week in the cotton fields of the Delta. For this music was created as much to escape the rigors of sharecropping and brutal manual labor as to shape a new form of expression through song. And the Delta blues sounded forth out of Mississippi on crude recordings cut in makeshift studios by enterprising white men from the North, and sent out on 78 RPM singles from Paramount, Noke, and Columbia to enter and reshape the lives of people of every description all over the world. The Delta sound, ringing up and down the line like a national steel guitar, framed in some little juke house in the middle of the woods, or the amplified blast of the electric guitar plugged into the wall in a nasty street corner bar on the south side of Chicago. The sound of Mississippi carried up from the Delta into the factories and tenements of the cities of the North, where peoples could make a living outside the cotton fields and be paid in cash dollars at the end of every week or two and conduct their lives in the ways that they saw fit. And the music sustained them as it had in the South, transforming the industrial noise of the urban landscape through amplified harmonicas and pounding pianos, and the crashing of drums and the Fender bass, a music of such great power and incredible beauty and depth of emotion, so deeply rooted in the lives of the people that their bitter experience could be shaped into art of the highest possible order that would inform all popular music for the rest of the century. But their rewards would never come. And the white man would reap the fruits of all their artistic labors as if they were balls of cotton in a 9-foot croaker shack. And the music of the Delta would be appropriated and exploited beyond measure by the descendants of the slaveholders and their bankrollers and the swell of their bulging coffers. And nothing would be returned to the people of the Delta, and their music would be taken away, and they would be left to face a terrible future of life in the ghetto with nothing to sustain them, nothing to carry them through the horrors of modern life, nothing but the watered down sound of what was once their music, played back at them by white people on every television set in America, nothing from the billions of dollars of profits to be realized from their creations, nothing to the creators, nothing to the people who created them, not even the dignity of being recognized for the enormity of their contribution to the cultural life of our nation. Nothing to the blues men, nothing to the blues people. That is what they mean when they talk about the blues. That is what the blues is all about, fattening frogs for snakes and watching the blankety blank snakes slither off with the very thing you have made. John Sinclair, fattening frogs for snakes. And I'm just trying desperately, just another middle-aged white dude who loves the blues, just a white boy from Detroit, just a white boy from the Midwest, trying to acknowledge the enormity of the contribution to the cultural life of our nation by the formerly enslaved blues people. By the formerly enslaved blues people. John Sinclair, fattening frogs for snakes. Some definitions. Oh, first we must stop. And I knew this was true, but I've studied up on it a little bit more recently. So this is that story of the formerly enslaved and the sometimes incarcerated folk. But Parchment Farm is a good, and there's a great documentary on Netflix about the 13th Amendment. There's a footnote in the paperwork. There's some fine print in the paperwork that emancipated the slaves. Maybe y'all missed that. There's some fine print. There's a footnote. There's some leverage in the paperwork that emancipated the slaves 160 or ish years ago, that allowed slavery to continue for people who are in jail. And so we have in America today a new form of Jim Crow. We have a new form of slavery. We have the school, the prison pipeline. We have the criminalization of being young and black and male and out in the wrong place at the wrong time, being young and black and male and smoking that stuff that we were talking about a few minutes ago that is slowly being legalized across the land. Hadn't got yet to Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee, mind you, where some great people could be lifted out of poverty, because we got a bunch of farmland and the agricultural sector is hurting. I mean, they could be growing that stuff. They could be taxing that stuff to pay for schools and to help the farmers out. But on the same place, Parchment Farm is an actual penitentiary in Mississippi where they put the jail on the same place of the plantation. They put the jail on the same place of the plantation. And to understand, I can't do the whole arc of African-American history in this talk because I want to focus on the art of the blues and the music that comes out of it later. But these are people who were stolen by gangster thugs and criminals, by really evil people who went to their homeland and stole them and brought them in chains here to make money for my people's ancestors, to make money, to make cash, so I didn't have to work. So I could sit up there and drink my tea, my sweet tea and my lemonade to make unearned profits for a very small portion of our lighter skinned ancestors. The elites have always been a small portion, right? That's why Brother Bernie calls them the 1%. So it wasn't all of our folk. It wasn't. We had lots of poor white folk in the Appalachia where we're from here today. So the blues music comes out of the tradition of the folk that were enslaved and then the folk that were mass incarcerated. As a matter of fact, some of the song hunters, and we're going to be learning a lot on Wednesday about the song hunters, some of the song hunters would go, and that's a little bit what Brother John was talking about in that poem, they would go into the jail and they'd make a record, and the guy who sang on the record would stay in the jail, and then they'd go sell the record, to make money, because this music was incredibly good. There's a track on the Parchment Farm in the mixtape that I gave you. So a little bit of a definition. I've kind of got a little bit carried away, and I want to kind of reel this thing in here. I've got to look at my my time here as well. I'm sure I will run out of time as we crash this lecture into the 10 o'clock hour, so you guys can get to the rest of your Monday and to the rest of your courses. And thank you for tuning in to the call this morning for a whole week about popular music and making mixtapes out of America. So Houston Baker's a professor from Vanderbilt, in his book over there in Nashville, Blues Ideology and the African American Experience of Vernacular Theory. He defines what the blues are, right? The blues are a synthesis combining work songs, group seculars, field hollers, sacred harmonies, proverbial wisdom, folk philosophy, political commentary, ribald humor, elegiac lament, and much more to constitute an amalgam. Amalgam is a mixture, a collage, a chaotic coming together of multiple things that seems to have always been in motion in America. This has always been in America, is these colliding stories that are becoming, shaping, transforming, displacing the peculiar experiences of Africans in the New World. And so from all of this bitter legacy, this heartbroken legacy of enslavement, and now even today mass incarceration, the gift of music keeps giving itself back to America, so we can hear what we sound like. We can hear ourselves. And so this is very important to understand, that from something very painful, something very terrible, something very beautiful is coming. And in both the gospel and the blues, there are different narratives, if you will, of freedom coming out of this story, right? So this is not a stagnant thing, as he says, that it's, in motion, right? It's still happening. It's still going on, and it's even, we're hearing this in so many different ways in the music that you're listening to today. So, right, you're going to still hear this music in your own music that you're listening to, which will, you might have to do a little bit of extra work for yourself to trace how it goes back to the gospel and the blues. But if you're listening to any popular music of any kind right now, today, it goes back to the blues, and it goes back. Some of the great people that have helped us writer in the Beat Generation unit is this idea that Black music is always radical in the context of American culture. It is always challenging us to look at who we really are honestly, and it's also pushing us to this new kind of, possibility of the beloved community, which Dr. King spoke about, which the dream was about, which was to break down the legacy and the lineage of these harms, but not to deny them or pretend they didn't happen, or to sweep them under the rug, or to sanitize them, or to whitewash them, or in any way dilute the potency of the pain, because this liberation arc takes us out of pain, and we go through many stages with it. One stage we go through is pleasure. We go through this joy that also includes the kind of wild side of the blues. It's not puritanical and pious. And watching some of the footage I've watched as I've studied this over the years, you can't always tell the difference between the juke joint and the Holy Ghost church on Sunday morning, because the power is so palpable. It's physical. It's not a head trip spirituality, and it's definitely not a head trip Saturday night. I mean, it's dancing and drinking and loving and all the kinds of ways that human beings like to do. James Cone also, so I've got, Amiri Baraka, he puts the blues kind of against gospel, like he's a rebel, right? And so I'm going back and forth between these two or three different narratives here. So, and also these come from secular critics versus more theologically grounded critics. So like Brother Moss, who I mentioned at the beginning, he definitely sees the blues and gospel as siblings working on the same story of liberation. James Cone, a Black theologian, also sees the Black church and the blues juke joint as working together for freedom. And Brother James Cone, gone on now, deceased, he said, the blues are a lived experience, an encounter with the contradictions of American society, but refusal to be conquered with it. So we're looking into everything that's beautiful and everything that's bad about America, and we're looking at it all with honesty and openness all at the same time, and we're not going to let it keep us down. The hope, see, this is ultimately a story about hope. And so even though I'm being honest about the negative aspects of our story, what Jim Wallace, who was a white preacher, called America's original sin, and I don't know that he coined that term, but he's the one who introduced me to it, is we're reckoning with America's sin, but we're looking forward to this hope that provides the strength to survive, and also an openness to the integrity of life's pains without being destroyed by them. And so we're still a blues people because we still have addiction, we still have conflict, we still are dealing with racism, all the things that this story, even 160 years old, it's still teaching us. This is a story that keeps on talking to us. And through my drives in Mississippi, to see the poverty in some of the rural areas of Mississippi, is to see that this story is being retold in tragic ways as well. Cornel West, very famous Black studies scholar, maybe one of him and Michael Eric Dyson, who both show up in today's lecture on the secular side, two of the most famous Black American intellectuals of our time. Now they're both also Christians, and so they wrestle with that tension that I'm talking about, where can the blues and the gospel work together or not. Brother West says the blues represent the Black American interpretation of tragicomic hope in the face of dehumanizing hate and oppression. And this idea of tragicomic is a great word. It's a made-up word. All words are made-up words, by the way. Everything's made up. As we learned last week, money is kind of made up too. GameStop, anybody? So this idea of tragicomedy is so important because it's getting beauty out of brokenness. It's like, why do you like sad songs? Why do you like sad movies? Why do I love to cry, in the movies? Why do I love to laugh? Why do I love comedies? Why do we like horror movies? Why do we want to be scared, scared, so terrified, when the world itself is already so terrifying? The blues capture that kind of tragicomedy. West says the tragicomic maintains, quote, the ability to laugh and retain a sense of joy, to preserve hope even while staring down hate and hypocrisy. Being an actor and also a hip-hop professor, he was in the Matrix movies. Those are old school now. West asserts that tragicomic hope expresses itself most profoundly in the retchingly honest yet compassionate voices of the Black freedom struggle. So that would be the civil rights movement, but also most poignantly in the painful eloquence of the blues, and most exuberantly in the improvisational virtuosity of jazz. And I'm not a musicologist, and jazz gets a short shift in this lecture. Whenever I have a music major in the class, I think I had a music major in the class last year, and they wanted there to be more jazz in this lecture, more John Coltrane. We'll get to that a little bit during the beat movement. So there's this tension, there's this freaky, like, bumping up against each other, but working itself out. That's called an antithesis, and a thesis makes a synthesis. That's called a dialectic. And so we have this dialectic of the thesis and the antithesis coming together to make something new. And that's what rock and roll is. Rock and roll is, born of the dialectic of black and white coming together, of Elvis and Chuck Berry. So the blues were revolt, gospel maybe submission, blues maybe maintaining more of the African lineage, gospel incorporating some of the European Protestant church stuff that they were learning in the plantation church. Blues being completely about rebellion, the gospel also being about redemption. And now, can rebellion and redemption meet or not? Saturday night, the tension between Saturday night and Sunday morning, the tension between the power of evil and the power of good, seen as the power of devil versus Jesus. But some Christians don't actually completely believe in a personified devil, like a character, like, they say the three persons of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. They don't necessarily see the character of the devil as having a bipolar power, where he's like straight up against. And one of the scholars I was looking at this weekend was reminding me that in the blues tradition, the devil might just mean the trickster, which you get out of like indigenous cultures, like Native American culture. It just might be, the God, little g God of the wild side of life. So maybe they're not completely up against each other. Maybe they are. If you are believing in a fully, representational, historical force of evil, evil's real, right? We aren't saying that evil isn't real. And then, of course, that old I mentioned the Apostle Paul at the beginning of this, the old Christian wrestling with the body, and sexual desire and the flesh and the spirit. This is where it gets really complicated and really interesting to do an analysis of the blues versus gospel. But because of the civil rights movement, because of the freedom struggle, we definitely see the blues and gospel working together as stories of freedom in the Black culture of the 20th century, last century. And continuing today, all the playlists and mixtapes that got dropped last summer to be the soundtrack to the movement for Black lives. So Angela Davis, this sister was very outspoken in the 70s movement, in the Black Power movement. She, of course, becomes very professorial in her later years, but a lot of people still really, really looked up to this. And she talks about Black women in the blues, and talks about how the blues women preached about sexual love. And in doing so, they articulated the collective experience of freedom. And so what we get in the sex part of the blues is that for newly freed people, the romantic in their lives, the romantic was a realm where they could experience freedom. And Davis writes, for the first time in the history of African presence in North America, masses of Black folk were in the position to make autonomous decisions regarding their sexual partnerships in which they entered. Sexuality thus was one of the most tangible domains, she says, in which emancipation was acted upon and through which its meanings were expressed. Sovereignty and sexuality marked an important divide between life during slavery and life after emancipation. At the same time that male ministers were becoming a professional caste, women blues singers were performing as professional artists and attracting large audience at revival-like gatherings. Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith were the most widely known of these women. They preached about sexual love, and in doing so, they articulated a collective experience of freedom, giving voice to the most powerful evidence there was that slavery was over. And then, of course, one of the things that the blues deals with so well is the cheating spouse. You know, you have this new freedom to enter into this romance, but then you also have the freedom to stray within the romance. And one of the great tragedies of romantic blues songs is that she did you wrong, right? My lady did me wrong, or my man did me wrong. And then you enter in the surrealist blues critics like Paul Guerin and this great, I love the frog on the Blues and the Poetic Spirit. And he doesn't buy into the gospel and the blues working together for freedom. He says that the religion has always been an agency of repression, attempting to crush the spirit of revolt and replacing it with the doctrine of accommodation. So he believes the Black church tradition was actually set up to keep people enslaved, basically. Now, that's a very controversial point when you see, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his descendant, now just recently elected to the Senate in Georgia, the Reverend Raphael Warnock, to see that, the folk in the church have something to say about that. Like Pastor Moss, my man, Reverend Otis Moss III, says blues and gospel are the same thing. When you have your blues, in the words of B.B. King, you say, my thrill's gone. But you want to switch it to gospel, don't change the chords, just change the lyrics to Precious Lord, Take My Hand. It's the same thing. You're just shifting the lyrics. And Pastor Moss will say, it's just dealing with different parts of our experience. And all of these forms of our experience are valid. So the blues deals with what's going on right now in the real world, right now, here, and the existential. And he says the gospel deals with the eschatological, which is the end of all things and the coming together of all things. And so the spiritual and the physical are important. Your social, cultural, political reality is important. You got enough food to eat, you got a job, do you have clothes on your back, can you feed your family, as well as, am I a whole person? Am I looking after my spiritual body, mind, and spirit? Am I looking after the whole self? And so Pastor Moss would see the two working profoundly together. This is going to be a catastrophically brief introduction to some of the tracks on your playlist, which I've emailed to you, which I want you all to listen to just like today. Put it on while you're doing your other stuff. Robert Johnson is at the top of the blues kind of mythology, especially because of, did he make a deal with the devil or not at the crossroads? Is he the first member of the 27 Club, which throughout the 20th and 21st century are great musicians, from Amy Winehouse to Kurt Cobain to Jimi Hendrix to Janis Joplin to Jim Morrison, who all died at the age of 27, tragically so. Robert Johnson is in your mixtape, as is Sam Cooke. I just watched a documentary about Sam Cooke. There's a couple of new movies out right now that address Sam Cooke, and he's got the track on there called Jesus Gave Me Water, which is his gospel side, but his civil rights side is change is going to come. But Sam Cooke in the 60s really took the blues music and made it popular. He took it into the realm of soul. There's a little bit of barbershop and doo-wop going in there. And then you're going to go into the whole Motown sound in the 60s, Marvin Gaye, all the great sound, Jackson 5 even. So you're going to see the pop side. So he's making blues accessible to a wider audience and definitely to a white audience. But listen to that man's voice on that track, Jesus Gave Me Water. A Staples singer, Pop Staples, and Mavis, his daughter, she's quite elderly now. She's keeping the Staples vibe alive. But they come out of the church, but they get involved in rock and roll and soul music, and they combine rock and roll and soul music to create their own unique sound. But then they start singing these anthems about the civil rights movement. So they're like the soundtrack to all the protest marches in the 60s. And you got a track in the playlist, I believe, Freedom Highway by them, which is about the Selma to Montgomery March. Curtis Mayfield, you're going to hear his band, The Impressions, was a gospel band, but he moves more over to rock and roll. And his song, People Get Ready, has been covered by everybody. And it's a freedom song, but it gets picked up by all the white artists, all the blues artists, all the rock and folk art. Everybody loves some Curtis Mayfield. And then he also went into the 70s, kind of into more some of the funk that was going to be in some of the great black movies, black cinema of the 70s, which I unfortunately had to leave off of that cinema list I made last Friday for you in the extra credit assignment I gave on last Friday. Nina Simone, if you've not listened to this sister sing, you got to. Great Netflix documentary. She lived a tragic life, but she was in the movement, and she's got a voice that's just going to blow your mind. Sister Nina Simone, what a legend. What a great and important person. I left off a slide, need a slide in here for Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I believe she's in your playlist, but Sister Rosetta Tharpe literally was a gospel singer who played blues and made rock and roll. So they consider Rosetta Tharpe to be the mother of rock and roll. And this woman, there's a video of her playing her guitar on YouTube, and she can shred like the greatest rock guitarist ever. Anyway, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, she should have had her own slide here, but I am going to have to finish this lecture. And just foreshadowing, and you're going to see a couple of proto rap tracks, very early hip hop in the playlist. But Dr. Dyson says that rap is a form of profound mutual cultural and social creativity. Rap explores the grammatical creativity, verbal wizardry, and linguistic innovation. And what really, hip hop, when, by the late 70s, a lot of the soul music, you had like the Commodores and stuff, it was starting to go down into like the easy listening, Earth, Wind, and Fire. This is all great stuff, but it was starting to get really commercialized. And then you had disco, starting to happen. And so hip hop shows up in the late 70s the same way that punk rock shows up in the late 70s to kind of put an injection of fire back into this thing, right? And so even though sonically hip hop doesn't sound a lot like the blues, lyrically it's talking about the same tragedies and the same inconsistencies and hypocrisies of society. So it talks about sex, talks about the street, talks about the drug culture. And I was just watching a video about the blues, actually, and they bring in a rapper who explains, you all think my lyrics are so bad. I'm a rapper today in the 21st century. Y'all think my lyrics are so bad. Go back and listen to the blues lyrics. The lyrics were bad. Man, they were bad back then too. We've always been bad. People been bad. We're good too. We're good and bad. We're a mixture of good and bad. And it's hard to live between those polarities all the time if you're like me, and you experience guilt and stuff. So you're going to hear a couple of proto-rap kind of spoken word pieces by Gil Scott-Heron and the Last Poets. And they will also represent what the movement was talking about at that time. The movement was very vibrant in the late 60s, early 70s. And so they're really going to capture what comes after civil rights, which is kind of the Black Power movement. And I forgot to put this on the links I just mailed you, but there's a sermon by Pastor Moss where he takes there's a Tupac Shakur song that winds up the playlist, but he takes a Tupac Shakur song and he takes the Palm Sunday text, which is Jesus basically being crucified, or as he says, Jesus being lynched. And so he takes the crucifixion of Jesus and he puts it into a mixtape with Tupac Shakur. And he does what he calls thug theology. And I have riffed on it before in this lecture. I'm not going to riff as good as Otis Moss. So I'm just going to send you, and he's the same guy that I've been quoting throughout the lecture. And there's me with him a couple of years ago at a conference in Minneapolis. So I'm just going to send you, and I consider him he's a little bit younger than me, but I consider him to be like one of my pastors, like at the national level, and one of my teachers, and somebody I've just been a fellow traveler with now for about 10 years. And Pastor Moss has just taught me so much. So I'm just going to send you that link to the Thug Theology sermon, and you guys can break it down however you want. So these things cut both ways. And there's a both and as well as an either or. Both and an either or. Both gospel and the blues, but also these contradictions as well, and these things that cannot be resolved. You know, some thesis and some antithesis cannot always be resolved in a dialectic, and evil is still among us. The evil of white supremacy and racism is still among us, and we're wrestling with that as a nation right now as we speak. And as a church, I mean, some of y'all are not religious, and that's fine. No, I'm not preach. It sounds like I'm preached for the whole lecture, but I'm not preaching. You know, I'm just teaching. But in the preaching side of the teaching, the American church is wrestling with that right now. They're having a reckoning right now around racism and white supremacy. It's something that it's a conversation that needs to be had. We've been having it since the movement. You know, we've been having it since slavery, but we need to have it again. We need to be open-minded about it. I thank you all so much for attending our this very. I talk so fast to squeeze it all in, and we are now at the 10 o'clock hour. Thank you all.